Don't be afraid of that. It's internal. It's somewhat private. Unless you say something really crazy, then we will mock and belittle you forever. Wow, nobody even laughed at that. Okay, dry crowd this morning. All right. I wanted to, I wanted to start off. Let me just see if I can share my screen here real quick. This is, I don't know if guys can see this. I'll zoom in a little bit. These are the kind of texts I get. I get this morning from Sonia Zitsumbo. Hey, Brain, what's your opinion on this? Is that what I've been relegated to? Hey, Brain. I thought that was great. Let's see here. I am going to pull this up, and we're just going to start with this morning. Each week, we have a call with our Gold Nation partners in currently 6 Western United States, right, representing about 3,500 agents. And on that particular call, we have all the managers, broker managers, and it's usually somewhere between 50 and 60 people on the call. So kind of a high-powered meeting, with I enjoy the meeting because you get to get a feel for what other people do and what their focus is in different areas. And you know what the takeaway is? Doesn't matter what state you're in, we're all largely dealing with the same thing. But having said that, I think for you guys on this call, having just a little bit of intel, this comes off of REMAX LLC's website, Max Center. And I think it's a great little eye candy piece, in addition to other things we've talked about over the years about staying forefront of mind with your agents and sharing brief amounts of information, right? Because the general public, they're not geeks like us. They're not neck deep in real estate all the time, right? It's a periodic venture into our arena. So we want to keep our messages very simple. So look at the ones I highlighted here, right? The 3 columns that I think are the most important one is, can you imagine this? Look, 144,000 REMAX agents. And when they average across 144,000, we're not talking executives with 8,000. We have an average transaction closed per year of 13.3 transactions. Guys, I don't know how else to say that. That's huge, right? And if I were in your shoes and if I was talking to somebody and they said, oh, I was considering so-and-so, I'm just going to use realty executives, right? Because they're the next row down. You never want to bash on another company. Why? Come on, participation this morning. Why do you not want to bash on other people? Dan?
Code of ethics suggests that maybe we shouldn't.
Well, there's that. Why is that fresh on your memory, Dan? No.
Yeah, no comment.
Outside of the code of ethics, which is important, just understand this: human nature. When the vast majority of people, when you bash on somebody else, it's the default human nature for them to turn around and say, yeah, and who are you? You're not all that in a bag of chips. And all of a sudden you're going backwards. So you can say things in such a way that you're still making the point and still coming off pleasant. Be like, you know what, we actually work with a lot of companies here in the Utah market, and there's a lot of companies, but if I were to put this in front of somebody electronically or a paper printout, I'd be like, we actually appreciate how hard everybody works, but I think you can see from this, right, that we have a lot of agents and demonstrated a lot of success because we actually have good systems and approach and history and leadership, which all, I know it may not seem like a direct connection to you, but it means more deals closed in our company, right? Outside of me and my glowing personality and how wonderful I am, I could say that if I was Jill, but I can't say that as Matt, not with any degree of intellectual honesty. But anyway, look at this: 13.3 transactions, almost 1 million sides closed, 750,000 sides in 1 year, right? And this other one, U.S. brand awareness. This isn't, hey, if you've seen us on TV recently in a balloon or a commercial. No, this is unaided brand awareness. So when somebody sees the REMAX balloon, even without the words REMAX, it triggers something in their mind. They already know what we're about. So anyway, that's just a little something today for our call to kick it off. And hopefully you can use that somewhere down the road. Okay. What did we cover last week? Anybody? You know, they say when you do a presentation, if you don't know that somebody's going to give you an answer, don't ask the question. So let me refresh your memory. We're kicking off the year by starting with our fundamental documents. And in this case, last week we talked about the REPC, and we had a specific focus on kind of buyer considerations, right? And so if you were smart, you'd be looking at my tabs because I get things prepared ahead of time, and you could have seen REPC Part 2, seller considerations. That's what we're going to cover today. And you know what? Let's make this free form. I do want questions. If they get too detailed or too off in the weeds, I will circle back with you after the call. But I do appreciate the feedback. All right, here we go. Remember, seller considerations. I know there's a lot of other things in the contract, but the focus today is going to be on that. So, wow, if I just said that, why in the world do I have earnest money highlighted in the first section? Come on. Anyone, chime in. If you don't chime in, I'm just going to start firing off questions to people individually. All right.
I'll add, Matt.
Yes, please,
Everybody
Susan.
needs to be concerned about the earnest money.
Say that again.
Everyone needs to be concerned about the earnest money.
Everybody, I agree with that. And I'm going to see your everybody should be concerned, and I'm going to raise you by a fiduciary responsibility, right? When we sign up as agents, one of the biggest fiduciaries we have that they cram a lot of stuff underneath is reasonable care. Reasonable care. Our clients are hiring us for a job, and this is why I say it's a big umbrella. Is it reasonable for them to expect us to do certain things? And if so, what are those? Earnest money is a fundamental component of the contract, not only for skin in the game, but for potential remedies by seller default or buyer default. And I can't tell you how many times over the years I've had to have this conversation. And so I was really grateful. You can see my note here. See the Division of Real Estate Q1 2022 newsletter that really put some flesh on this. Everybody should be concerned, but specifically the buyer's agent, the seller's agent, and their corresponding brokers should equally be concerned under that fiduciary of reasonable care. So I am going to queue up that letter. Everybody know who Van Kagi is? The brokers know. Van Kagi has been one of the Division of Real Estate's investigators forever. He's a walking repository of information, and every quarterly newsletter, he puts something out about our business and what we're supposed to do. So I'm just going to highlight these real quickly. Who has the greater responsibility in making sure earnest money is deposited? Obviously, I have it highlighted here. The answer is both. Licensees representing a client on a transaction have a fiduciary, translated legal responsibility, to their client to make sure that the buyer's earnest money has been delivered according to the terms of the REPC and receipted, regardless of who you represent. Just be quiet and let that one hang in the air for a minute, right? Because I have people all the time be like, well, the buyer's agent was supposed to make sure that was there, right? So let's just do a quick hypothetical. If earnest money didn't get deposited, right, and usually this raises its head when somebody is now making a claim because of default for earnest money, and all of a sudden we get a, oops, earnest money is not in the trust account, right? And the very next statement is almost always some version of, well, the buyer's agent, the buyer's broker was responsible to get that in the trust account. Does everybody from reading this understand how incorrect that is now? You can't, as the seller's representative, turn around and point the finger at the buyer's agent because they've made it explicitly clear here, you had an equal responsibility to make sure that earnest money was in. How do you do that? How do you make sure earnest money was in the trust account? Come on, this isn't hard.
You get the earnest money receipt document signed and delivered.
Confirmation of earnest money receipt. Very simple document, right? It's basically like a sworn affidavit of sorts from the other side saying, yep, we have the earnest money. Now, here's an interesting part. I better zoom in. This is probably small on your screen. Okay, I highlighted some things here. It says acceptance of the REPC by the buyer and seller and receipt of earnest money by the brokerage. Which brokerage?
Either.
And the brokerage shall have 4 days to get it into the brokerage's real estate trust account. Whose? Is it required in our contract that it be at the buyer's brokerage? We've just done it that way forever, and it's kind of become a de facto way of doing it, but there is absolutely no specific requirement that it be in the buyer's brokerage. I can just tell you from experience in our company, there have been multiple instances where we say, there are some brokerages out there representing buyers who don't have a trust account or don't put earnest money in a trust account, and they want to put it at title, which has its own bag of issues. And we have turned around and said, no, and this is negotiated in the REPC, no, we will actually hold the earnest money at the seller's brokerage. Can we do it? Absolutely. Okay, I just want to start off with that fun one to show how there's so many misconceptions about what the REPC is, what it requires, how we do it, why we do it. And so keep your mind open to look for the things that probably fall outside of your preconceived notions, because my favorite saying is, it's never a problem. I thought I'd get a chorus here, but apparently not. It's never a problem.
Until it's a problem.
Until it's a problem. And then it's a panic, right? Okay. So again, with the seller's focus, obviously property description is important. We really don't tend to see this as a responsibility as a general rule of the sellers, to, hey, here's the included items. But it does become very important when we talk about excluded items, right? And we get many times where somebody says, well, we told the buyer, we assumed, we blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter if it's not in the contract. So, simple example. I was thinking about this before today's call. Everybody's seen you can see at Costco, they have like these Yale digital deadbolts that you can put on. They're like 150, 200 bucks. They're not cheap. And guess what I have run across with our agents multiple times? When it comes time to hand off the property, guess what's missing? The Yale digital deadbolt, and it's replaced with a standard $20 deadbolt, just a hardware deadbolt, right? If you as the seller, and we'll cover that later on, but if you as the seller don't want to include that, if you don't want to include your Nest thermostat, if you don't want to spell it out, please spell it out. The amount of time it takes you to spell it out here is an exponential factor less than trying to resolve it after people go down the pathway and something's missing and feelings get hurt, and then people start reading in bad intentions of everybody else, and you're dealing now with an absolute cluster of problems. Okay, if you haven't experienced that, I promise you it's a real thing. Haley, go ahead.
Hey Matt, I had a deal just the other day. An agent been in the business 5 years and didn't know that curtains and curtain rods were included or that TV mounts were included. So those are my two sticking points usually for people. And so I always just throw them in the included things now so that we can have that conversation. Yeah. Because I'm just surprised at how many agents aren't reading the fine print.
Ran across one, good point. Thank you, Haley. And the curtain rods one is hilarious to me because it literally says it in the contract. If they've ever read their contract, it's in there. Draperies, curtain rods, blinds, by default, they're in. Okay. But I ran across one the other day on a higher end property where the buyer said, seller to include all entertainment tech systems. You like that? Anybody see a problem with that? Who defines what an entertainment tech system is? So my advice to the agent was politely be like,
Be
hey,
specific.
Say that again, Randy.
Be specific.
Be specific. You know what? I can generally classify why things aren't done the right way. The highest probability of why they're not done the right way is, well, twofold: ignorance and lazy. It's almost always those two things. Well, I didn't think I needed to do that. Nonetheless, here we are with a mammoth problem that we shouldn't have had to deal if you had just simply said, hey, buyer, you put in the tech system, we're going to counter back and just say, here's what we say that includes, and enumerate the systems, 2 flat screen TV, 65-inch, LG, there's an Epson projector, there are the following Sonos equipment in the closet. Take a picture of it, add a picture of the equipment in the closet as an exhibit to the contract. Can we do that? All day long we can, right? An ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. Okay. All right. Water service. We talked about this. Some of this is a buyer's responsibility. I decided to highlight it again on the seller side, right? And I really should have highlighted this. There we go. I feel better now. Water rights and or shares, right? And we did a separate class on this, so I'm not going to spend the time to right now go through the differences. But the contract in its default position covers any water rights or shares, but there's a condition. What's the condition? There's your big if. So let's highlight this as we go. And here is the condition. Right. That if, although it's a very small word, is a huge conditional in the contract. And I've actually dealt with this many, many, many times, and I have to bring the other agent or the other broker back and say, did you read section 1.4? Yes. And you say this in a polite way, but it's, did you understand the word if? Right? Because if we don't jump that hurdle, everything that comes after the if condition doesn't apply. Right? So if it's not the legal source of irrigation, if it's not the source of culinary, it's off the table. And you should have written a better contract and specifically included what you want, right? So I say a lot of these things to you guys so that you become, you're already good. I want you to become more contract minded. Look for words like if and or and conditionals, because they really do matter in contracts. I think the problem is sometimes they're so small, people just blow past them and don't really read through it. Go ahead, Jill.
Okay, so because I'm new to the state, I just want to ask this question. With water service, is this, when you hear this, if the legal source for seller's current culinary water service and irrigation service, is this issue more pertaining to like ag properties, horse properties, things like that? Because are we seeing this issue in developments such as like tract homes, things like that?
Yeah, good question. I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because yes, I would say that the vast majority are some type of agricultural products, not always, right? But we don't see it in tract homes, right? Because they're hooked up to the city. Now, here's an exception to that, right? Some of the cities have come back and retrofitted the properties with green water or irrigation water. And sometimes there's a fee that's been paid for that. I remember years ago, Spanish Fort came in and tore up the whole city. Dan, I don't know if you remember that. They were doing laterals to every property, and they assessed everybody, $1,500 or so for connecting to irrigation water. And, somebody could, in that scenario, Jill, as an example, what if they didn't pay the $1,500? I don't want the irrigation water, but a buyer comes in looking and hears from the neighbors that they have irrigation water, and all of a sudden they're closing on the property and there wasn't irrigation on this particular house, right?
Is this ever specified though, like on the title report?
I wish I had a title rep on the call right now, because some of this,
that's how it is in California. Usually if there's like a stipulation, there's like, it's on the title report. So I'm just,
yeah, our title companies do a good job, but it's as good as the city has been in recording these things, or as the state engineer is recording these things. So I would not rest my hat on that and say, oh, if it's not in the title report, it's not there, right? Or if it is in the title report, that everything's copacetic, right? The one example I have on this, and I'll move on, but there was a transaction we had in the company a few months ago, and the sellers had some water shares, but eventually they got incorporated into a city. Their property got incorporated into the city. The city started to provide water. And since these water shares that the seller had were now somewhat worthless, at least for that particular property, the city gave the seller a credit, like I can't remember, 3-5 years worth of credit on water. And when the buyers came in, they said, well, we understand that there are water rights attached to this property. It was true. Were they the current legal source of water? The city was now providing the water. That was the legal source. And then they went so far as to say, well, you're getting a credit from the city, and so we want that credit too. I'm like, but that's not what the contract says.
So how are we helping our buyer, aiding them in their due diligence with all of this? I mean, if the seller didn't disclose it, how would we know? Sorry to beat a dead horse, but like, I just want to know that.
Oh, it's a great question. And let's surrender for a minute. Most of the time, it's not going to apply to tract homes. But if we were in an area, so I'm in Utah County, south end of the county has a lot of agricultural land. Some of it's dry farm, some of it has irrigation water, strawberry shares, stuff like that. One, you as the agent, if you see on the property that there's a well, or if you see that they're doing some type of agricultural, it should be a red flag to do some investigation, right? And we'll get to seller's disclosures in a minute. There's a blank for other, and you can ask them and require for them to provide any additional information, and it gives you a level of protection, right? Because then the responsibility becomes theirs, right? So that's a good way to handle it. Great question. All right, so that was water service. I'm going to skip, purchase price and all that. That's typically determined, right, by the buyer who's making the offer. I just wanted to touch on this one. Possession. Oh my gosh. Can we please, whether we're representing the buyers or the sellers, make sure they understand the difference between settlement, right, recording, and possession? 3 separate, distinct things that have consequences. If you're representing a seller, I'm just going to paint with a broad brush and suggest this. Please, if they're occupying the property, unless they want to, please don't put upon recording. I can't tell you how many times. I can't even count on. I mean, literally in my career, it's probably not a joke to say over 100 times where this has become an issue, right? The agent, not paying attention to the contract, accepts it from the buyer saying, yep, upon recording. Listen, let's take off our hat for a minute. If you're the seller, right, do you really want to move all of your stuff out of your house before you know that funds have been transferred, before the deed is recorded and they are now the owner of the property? As a general rule, I think the answer is no. I want to make sure everything's done before I'm going to move my stuff out of my house. I hate moving. And I think I'm not alone in that. So I think it's reasonable to do that. So double check Section 3.3 when you're representing a seller. If the buyer put upon recording, counter back. Like, hey, you know what? We want to give you the house as quickly as possible, but can we do 24 or 48 hours after recording to make sure everything's done? And that'll give us time to bring cleaners in and whatever else, right? Make it palatable for them. And it just solves so many unnecessary problems.
Hey, one thing I could add to that,
Yeah, do, Randy.
Matt, is also the seller really can't go back on the property after it's been exchanged and it's been recorded and that move-in date is asserted, because then they're guilty of trespassing too. I mean, if they have to come back to get something that they just didn't quite load or finish the move, it creates a problem. The buyer, that's their property now. That's theirs, and they can't have the seller come onto their property without permission. So anyway.
You know what? It's so funny you say that. It's funny you say that, because I've had the new owners upset that the seller came back on the property to get a hose that was attached to a hose bib. I mean, these are the stupid little things. I don't know how they get so significant. It's like dealing with petulant children. I'm like, oh my gosh, I will pay for a new hose if you could just make this go away. But you're right. Once possession, so I want to make a clarification. Settlement, everybody signed. Closing is it's recorded in the new owner's name. but there is a contractual opportunity for the seller to still be on the property so long as the possession section of the contract gives them permission to be there. But once you pass the possession deadline, all bets are off. And you're absolutely right, Randy. Okay, special assessments. This should be obvious for everybody, but in case it is not, I would say we need to pay particular attention to this, right? And the devil's in the details, right? So we all know special assessments, like if you're an HOA and it's 20 years old and they're going to start repairing the roofs, and they've assessed everybody a fee. And that's kind of the mentality most agents think of this, but as you read the details of this section, right? Any assessments for capital improvements as approved, doesn't have to be done, approved by the homeowners association, right? Or remember those words, if and or, they matter in contracts significantly, or as assessed by a municipality or a special improvement district. And I would also say, or a PID. And what is the criteria? As long as it was done prior to settlement deadline. I've had so many people say, well, we disclosed what we knew at the time the offer was made. It's like, but that's not what the contract says. During the contract period, you still can get communications from the HOA, from the city, from an improvement district, and your affirmative obligation is to let the other side know about it. And oh, by the way, depending on how we have it checked here, right? If we said it's the seller's responsibility, you're on the hook. You're on the hook. Anybody have any experience with this? Want to share? It's not fun because sometimes those can be significant amounts. And so make sure when you're representing, obviously, a buyer, I think at a bare minimum, let's make sure our starting point is everybody's going to participate, right? If I want to be a little more aggressive, I'm representing the buyer, I'll say it's the seller's responsibility. But I would also tell my buyer, be prepared that the seller may come back and say, yeah, no, we're going to split it, right? And all these things, it just depends on the situation. So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with that. But this is a significant section because it can be expensive. And anytime you deal with the financial component of things, it's the great magnifier of whatever the person's personality and disposition is. That's one of the great learnings we learn in this industry. Money is the great magnifier, good and bad. Okay.
Yeah.
And,
Can I just make
Question
a
on
quick
that.
comment to support that, Matt?
go ahead, Josh.
I had a condo in Saratoga Springs. I think it was 2 years ago that I was selling for my client. And on this condo, they had a special assessment that the whole building, everything, all of the buildings were going to be completely redone on the exterior. All of the stairs were falling and failing. All the decks on all these condos were failing as well. And it was going to be a $30,000 assessment
On a
per
condo.
homeowner. And it was still in negotiations with what was going to happen. In the middle of us selling it, the HOA came back and said, yep, we finalized it. It's going to be, I think it ended up being 25,000. It may have been 30, but it was a special assessment that happened right in the middle of our negotiations. And luckily my client said, I don't want to deal with this property anymore. I'm done with it. So he was willing to do a concession of quite a substantial amount of money for that buyer.
Yeah. Can you imagine if your seller had $15,000 of equity and all of a sudden there's been an assessment for $30,000? We've got a challenge. You know what I mean? So these are real world things. And I'm glad you guys are all on the call, getting better at your craft. All right. Close cousin to the special assessments is item C. Notice it says HOA or other entity fees due upon change of ownership. So listen, going back to 2007, 2008 is when we really saw this crop up in the state of Utah. I know it's been a thing in other states for a long time, but it really became more of a thing in 2007, 2008, because builders were taking it in the shorts with the correction, and they were trying to figure out a way to monetize their investment over time to collect some money back. And so you started to see a lot of these transfer of ownership fees, right? And notice this portion I have highlighted in red down here, regardless of how the change of ownership fee is titled, because trust me, they get really creative on how they call this. It's like, we'll hide it so people won't know what it really is. But regardless of that, we're going to specify affirmatively in the contract whose responsibility it is. What is the worst example of this in the entire state? It's a particular area. Southwest.
Daybreak.
Daybreak, Carrie.
Yep.
It's not so much that Daybreak's bad. It's just there's a master HOA, and then there's a
Sub HOA.
and then there's a neighborhood HOA, and all of them have their own fees and they have their own transfer fees, and so it can add up pretty quickly. So it's good to be aware of them. Yeah, Daybreak. It's a great community. I didn't mean to bash on it. I'm just saying they are a good example of pay attention, right? Pay strict attention if you're doing a deal out in Daybreak, and make sure this portion of your contract is ironclad. All right, we're going to move on down here. Title. What is fee title to a property? Right? I mean, it's right there in the contract. We're the practitioners. Seller represents that the seller has fee title to the property. Anybody want to venture a guess? If not, I'll pull it up on screen.
There's
for
no
you.
there's no liens against it.
Yeah. There we go. I did a little Googling before we got on here, and I just found that one that I thought was great. Fee simple interest. Fee simple is the standard interest insured on most transactions. It's the descriptive term for absolute ownership of the land or the property, right? So let's compare and contrast. If there is a tax lien, do you have fee interest to the property? Nobody wants to venture. Scott, what do you think?
Does who have fee interest?
Does the seller, because the seller is the one that is affirming that they have fee title to the property.
Well, if there's a tax lien on it, then they have a problem with having fee and the fee. Yeah.
Can the government sell your property if you don't pay your taxes?
Absolutely.
So coming back to it, I would make the case you don't have fee title until that lien is removed. So be careful with this, right?
Wouldn't that be the same with anybody that has a mortgage on a property though? I mean,
a mortgage, not so much, because a mortgage isn't an ownership interest unless you default, right? Where a tax lien is, yeah, the government's already established, you owe us money, you haven't paid, and the clock is ticking. If you don't pay us, we're selling your property.
I see.
Right. So I know it's a subtle distinction. It's a great question. All I'm saying here, guys, is as we work with our clients, and we're all sitting at tables or wherever else, or talking to them on the phone or a Zoom, and certain things, our questions come up. One, I hope all of this is showing you that there's probably more questions we should be asking our clients to protect them and us as we go through the process, right? And I think I'd spend a little time here. Like, listen, are you aware of any problems with conveying ownership? I mean, are there any tax liens? Are there, what's the
Judgments?
Judgments? Yes. What childcare? What do they call that?
Alimony or
ORS,
child
right? Office of Recovery Services, or any of those things that could impair transferring ownership, because you're really making an affirmative declaration here that you have absolute interest in the property and can convey marketable title. Could somebody make the case, if you had those problems, that you misrepresented and that you're in default of the contract? I'll leave that to the attorneys. I just don't even want to open the door for that. So I would have some good questions. Okay. Now, section 6.2, title insurance. I know it's boring, right? And we pitch it over the fence like, it's the title company. But there's actually some governing language on here, right? So we all know this. Seller's going to provide an insurance policy to the buyers, right? But there's some interesting language here. Through the title insurance agency that issued the commitment. That's a contractual term, right? You're agreeing contractually, whoever gave you the PR, you're actually going to use them unless there's something else later in writing, that you're going to use them to provide the policy. And specifically, it's a Alta homeowners policy versus down below at the end of the paragraph, an owner's policy. And there is a significant difference. If you don't know that, go have a chat with your Metro title rep and get them spun up for you. Or I did a training on it a while ago. But anyway, the title company who gave the initial commitment takes on this term, issuing agent, right? And then it goes into some conditions, right? You're going to use, if that policy, meaning the homeowner's Alta homeowner's policy, isn't available through the company who gave you the commitment, then buyer or seller further agree that the seller will pay for a homeowner's policy if it's available through a different title agency. And then further in item B, if the homeowner's policy is not available either through the issuing agent or any other title agency, then the seller agrees to pay for and the buyer agrees to accept a lesser policy known as an Alta owner's policy. It doesn't have as much coverage, right? So it would be easier to get, and that's why they put it that way. Okay. These are big deals, guys, right? It may not be a big deal during the transaction, but if something were to crop up after the transaction, if you know, we haven't, two things. One, if you don't follow this, something can say you're not following the contract. Secondly, you want to make sure that your buyer especially understands that, hey, listen, if there's some reason we can't get the bigger policy, right? And by the way, what's better than an Alta homeowner's policy of title insurance? What's the next level up? An extended policy. An extended policy. Because this policy basically says they're insuring against anything that is readily available via public records. An extended policy gives you coverage beyond that. Even if it's not recorded at the county, they will provide coverage. It also costs about 50% more on average for that additional coverage. Anyway, just make sure people go in eyes wide open. That's not hard to explain, right? We got two types of policies, one with more coverage, one with less. If the one that's not available, the one with more coverage is not available, everybody's agreeing that we're going to go ahead and have the seller pay for a lesser policy. But there's hurdles that have to be jumped along the way, right? If you were the public and I just gave you that brief synopsis, do you feel better about that paragraph and understanding a little bit what it's saying? Okay, good.
I have a question.
Yeah, Bill.
So,
Bill, what would a call be without a question from you?
yeah, so it's true. Yeah, it would be a call, I'd be sleeping or I'd be doing something else. So you talk about the issuing agent.
Yes.
So a lot of times you get in a real estate transaction, most of the time there's split transactions and title reports start flying all over the place. Everybody has everybody's email, everybody has it, and it's like, so it, you know, like just because the buyer's title company completes their policy first and sends it around doesn't mean that's I mean, I wouldn't think that would mean that's the issuing agent.
It is not.
I mean, I get it's a separate policy, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not, right? Because the commitment would be from the seller, right? Their commitment, whoever they engage for a commitment, right? And you know what? And that's why I put the asterisk there, Bill. Can we change this? Sure. It happens all the time. But if we're going to make sure we're protected contractually, let's just make sure that whatever changes we do make, everybody agrees to in writing. I don't know, something as simple, buyer and seller agree, we're going to use Metro Title for any title insurance policies, you know, issued. Simple, right? Then it kind of trumps any details that are in this section, right? But barring that, there is governing language. So great point.
So let me ask another question. So I've been in a transaction before where, you know, I kind of get on autopilot and send stuff over to my regular title person or whatever. And then the seller's like, oh, hey, this person with XYZ title lives next door and I want to use them. And then, you know, so
can I suggest something when they say that? Then just come back with, and I want a pony. Well, what you get are two different things. Yes,
we're
Haley.
just talking about the seller title company.
Correct, but if you look,
we're not talking about the buyer's title company because that's their own thing with the lender's policy.
Right, but I'm
we're
glad
just talking about the seller side.
for sure.
Okay.
And you're right. And here's, I think, to Bill's point. Sometimes we as the listing agent, whatever happens, we get a call, the buyer's agent is Johnny on the spot or whatever, sorry, Josette on the spot. And they just send it over and we think, oh, well, this is easier for me. They've already done the work, right? And so I'm just going to use that PR and we'll use that company. Well, we've put our seller in a little bit of jeopardy, potentially, because of this language here, unless it's covered in writing. So Bill, point is well taken. Let's make sure we understand what the default is, govern to that. If there's any changes, that's what I always say, get it in writing. Don't assume, don't just take people's word for it. Our contract requires any changes to be in writing.
Right.
All
Well,
right.
let's go back to what you just said a little bit ago about like when you said, well, yeah, and I want a pony. Well, like there's a ton of title people out there that do very good work.
Yes.
And for me to trash talk other people or their neighbor or someone that they have a good friend with, a relationship with, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's not just, I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but
Right.
usually when they have a relationship with someone, great. Okay, let's use your people. I mean, if that's what you want to do, it's your transaction. I can only make recommendations.
Right. But if you're the seller's agent, to Haley's point, I think if I were you, and we're doing a little role playing, you're the aggressive buyer's agent who has a super on top of it title company, and you tell me, Matt, I've already got the title done. Can I just send you over the PR? We'll use this company, blah, blah, blah. My response would be something like this: Bill, man, I love working with you. It's rare that I get an agent that's so proactive. And you know what? If there wasn't language in the contract that had specific governance on it, barring anything in writing, I would be like, yeah, let's go forward. So two things. One, if my seller's okay with using that company, we will get that in writing and capture it in an addendum. Fair enough?
I think it's misunderstanding. I'm saying if the seller, not the buyer's agent, if the seller has a relationship with the title person and they want to use that title person, I'm not going to tell them, at least I wouldn't think, well, I want a pony too.
Oh yeah, you're right. No. We always do what's in the best interest of our clients and what their request is. If they don't want to use Metro, right? That's our sister.
Right. But so my point is, before they tell me that, I get the PR from my regular people.
Well, you
and
need
then
to
they
ask,
come back
Bill.
and tell me,
Just-
oh,
you
hey,
have
this
to
is who I
ask.
want to use.
Yeah. So that's good for you being proactive, but ultimately you and I know as sellers agents that if they say, yeah, thanks for that, Bill, but no, we can't shoehorn them in. They say, I've got a friend over at Fatco, and that's who I want to use. Okay, I gave it my best shot. I'm trying to help AIG, but ultimately it's the seller's choice. So
Right, but I'm just saying, if I already had that other thing and then say I sent it to the other people, now I'm contractually bound to that title company even because I didn't know that.
No, you don't have the ability to bind them contractually, right? Because you, as the buyer's or the seller's agent, proactively did something without their request. The contract is clear, right? That the seller agrees to pay for their commitment, not yours. So if you went off and did it yourself, that's on you. Ultimately, they get to decide who they're going to use for title, and that PR should be sent over. So in your situation, if that were the situation, I call the agent on the other side and be like, hey, I was trying to get ahead of the game, thought we were going to use Metro. Apparently my seller wants to do this. And as long as we're within the seller's disclosures deadline, I update you with a new PR from the seller and the people they wanted to use. We're golden. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Seller's disclosures. All right, let's see time. We have 15 minutes and I have seller's disclosures and a few sundry items to cover. So I think we're on track. All right. Big pet peeve from a principal broker.
Sorry, Matt. I see that you have this thing. It says under item 7, seller disclosures, not providing seller disclosures is a material breach of the contract. I'm assuming anytime it says, anytime it says shall, that means that it's a material issue.
It's a good leading indicator, right? The reason I put that comment up here, and oh, by the way, I think I have one. Oh yeah, I had a little note up there for the DRE newsletter, but it's usually from experience working with attorneys who, when things are being litigated, they're like, this actually is a material breach. By the way, earnest money not being deposited, material breach, yes or no? 100% material breach. Seller's disclosures and deadlines. I'm just going to give you a quick anecdotal story to capture your attention. There was a group here in Utah County, an agent and an attorney working together. This goes back about 5 years ago. They were putting out all kinds of offers, and they were great offers, right? If a house was listed for 500, they were listing it or offering 520. And you know what they did in the contract? They said seller's disclosures to be 6 hours after acceptance. Guess what most agents are not paying attention to? Seller's disclosures deadline, right? And seller's disclosures are, and it has held up in court over and over again, are a material breach of the contract. Guess how much earnest money they were putting down on these offers? $10, $15, $20,000. And as soon as they didn't get the seller's disclosures, guess what they were doing? Canceling and demanding item A of section 16, which is the default remedy for an equal amount of earnest money. Pretty scummy, right? Pretty scummy. So seller's disclosures are a big deal. And the first thing I want to say is please, 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 when you hear seller's disclosures, please do not think the seller's property condition disclosures. Think items A through K in section 7. That's what your mind should be thinking when you hear the term seller's disclosures. It's not a document. It is a multitude of documents. All of those are considered seller's disclosures. So I'm going to draw your attention to item A. The first one I think is super interesting. In contracts, and I did I think a broker minute or two on this a while ago. I lose track of them all. But talking about the terms of the contract, and especially ones that are capitalized and proper terms of a contract and how that has significant meaning contractually. Guess what is absent in item A? It doesn't say capitals seller's property condition disclosure. It says the seller will provide a written seller lowercase property condition disclosure for the property, completed, signed, and dated by the seller as provided in section 10.3. If you want to double check that and make sure I'm not snowing you, we go to section 10.3 and it says the same thing, right? Disclose in writing defects. Carefully review, complete, and provide to the buyer a written seller lowercase property condition disclosure. So what does everybody assume that is referring to? Everybody
Seller's property,
Yeah,
the seller's property condition disclosure.
right.
That's right.
The UAR form, guess what it does not require? It does not require the UAR form. And that is just to a lot of agents and brokers out there. The simple example I use for this is if a seller out for a drink decided to take a cocktail napkin and write on it, seller property condition disclosure, I know nothing, signed Matt Barton. Have they jumped the hurdle?
I mean, if they signed it in your name.
You know what I'm saying, Parker. No, I'm being facetious for a reason, right? To demonstrate, don't think there's more here contractually than there is. And guess what? If it is really important to you, then guess what? In your addendum, because almost always we're going to do an addendum and counteroffer or something, spell it out. Item A to include the UAR form, seller's property condition disclosure. Guess what? Nobody does. They don't do that. And so, and then they get all upset when the seller doesn't provide that form. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
When I look at the exclusive right to sell, as you've taught us, it says that the entire agreement is including that seller's property condition disclosure.
Ah, Susan, very astute. I'm glad you brought that up. Two different contracts. They're not linked.
Even when we're representing the seller?
So the seller has agreed to provide to us, the company, a signed copy. Now listen, I'm straining at gnats here. I get it.
All right.
But if a seller had filled out those forms per their ERS with us, and we had it on file, and then a seller said, you know what? I don't want to send that over to the buyers. I want to just type up a note and say, here's what I know, and send that over, and I'm going to sign my name to it. Could they do that?
Yes.
Yeah, they could. They absolutely could. Could they find a form online from XYZ law firm in Connecticut that does seller's disclosures? Could they? Yeah, they could contractually in the REPC. So it's a good point, Susan. I'm just I'm just pointing this out so that if we didn't provide what was expected by the other side, assumed by the other side, we're still not in breach of contract. I know Susan's like, damn it, Matt, why do you keep muddying the waters? Except Susan will never say damn it.
Well, no, I won't, but my mother, never mind. The thing is why would the UAR create that and not put it in the REPC? I don't understand that. So I'm sorry, that probably doesn't need to be discussed here, but that's.
I will give you the short answer on that. I love UAR and how much they do on our behalf, but it is not perfect. And they have a forms committee that meets a few times a year, and it is a very slow moving, reactive organization. And as I'm going through and making these highlights, trust me, there's a whole other set of things I'm like, this shouldn't be written this way, right? We should actually be saying this. And Lance Harrison and Craig Wagner, I think they get tired of, I think they're screening me now because they know when I call or I send an email, it's going to be a bomb video with things on the screen and highlighting and showing. And I joke about that. There's been several times they're like, you know what? Never thought about this. That's a great point, right? So for instance, in our ERS, it talks about buyer's agency commission. Ugh. That's a UAR form. There is no such thing as buyer's agency. You cannot, per the Division of Real Estate, pay a buyer's agent. You can only pay the brokerage, right? So that's one of the ones I documented for, and hopefully will be changed in the near future. So it's a good point. All right.
Going back to the seller's disclosures really quick, if I provide all of those documents as an attached documentation on the MLS, does that suffice that rule where it says it shall be provided, the following documents shall be provided in hard copy or electronic format? If it's on the MLS and it's attached document, does that count?
I'm going to use a computer term, and I've had this discussion with other brokerages, and it stands up. We get times, and I think this is where you're going, Josh. We get times where it's like, well, we gave them a link to an HOA page that has that information. That's not what the contract says, right? Because I could take the spectrum of the public out there, and I could be dealing with somebody like me, older, who's technically not savvy, and I wouldn't be able to find the information on the crappy HOA website, right? And this is why, to your point, in the seller's disclosures, it says the seller shall provide, not I'm going to give you a link and you hunt it down and find it. So it's a push requirement, a pushing of the information from seller to buyer, not a here's a link that you as the buyer now become the puller of the information. Does that make sense?
Yep, that clarifies it, because I've been sending out, like for land deals, there could be 15 to 20 or even more documents for land transactions if I'm representing the seller. And so I've been sending out links to a Google Drive with that information in there. And so what you're saying is that is something that we should highly be cautious about, and instead just send over the PDFs, 15, 20.
I'll take your highly cautious and I'll be more specific. You have an affirmative obligation on behalf of your client to deliver the information, not a link. We had this with an HOA up in Traverse Mountain, and they were insistent that, well, it was on the website that we gave you the link to. I'm like, that's not what the contract says. And they ended up paying.
Okay.
Well,
All
and
right.
besides that, you can't put 7C on the MLS before you have a buyer's name.
Right.
You
There's
just can't.
there's a lot of reasons, but I want to make sure that what Josh brought up is very clear. It's never adequate enough to say they could have found this on a site, a link. Your job is to affirmatively give it to them. So I've got 5 minutes. I've got to rattle. Sorry for shutting this down. Really quickly, the remaining items, commitment for title insurance that Bill was just referring to, CC&Rs, rules and regulations. So that's not one thing. It's CC&Rs proper, and then any other rules and regulations affecting the property. You have an obligation to provide those. Most recent minutes, not oh, the most recent one I received. Your seller has an obligation to get with the HOA and get the most recent minutes and deliver those and the financial statements. Long-term leases, short-term rental bookings, right? Existing property management agreements. If you have somebody there, it's been a rental and you've got a property management and a contract signed, you have to disclose that, what that is, so they can negotiate that before becoming owners. Evidence of any water rights, we beat that one to death. Written notice of any claims, this is a big one, FERPTA. It's the worst name ever, FERPTA. But in a nutshell, if the seller's a foreign national, right? They need to know ahead of time, and they need to disclose to the other time some of the proceeds can be tied up. So let's just read it how they say it here. Seller is advised that the buyer or other qualified substitute may be legally required to withhold this tax at closing. So if the seller has $100,000 of equity and they're a foreign national, right, and they haven't paid their taxes or whatever is owed, until that is clarified and been cleared with the IRS, the title company and the buyer are required to hold that amount of money from settlement until that is clarified and the amount's paid. Otherwise, if they don't, the buyer is still going to be responsible to pay for it. That's why the provision is here in the contract, right? And so I get people in the past who said they can't do that. Well, you actually sign a contract where you're stating that is going to be the case. So you don't get to reverse that unless you have something in writing. Okay? Very big deal. And by the way, it depends. I mean, the number is somewhere around 15% of the proceeds, right? Is the amount that is typically held. You can go read, put it on your nightstand. It'll help you go to sleep at night. Go read all the details about FERPTA. All right. 10.3 conditions of the property, seller acknowledgements. Doesn't say buyer acknowledgements, seller acknowledgements. One, we're going to disclose the defects, right? This is an extension of the seller's disclosures. B, carefully review and provide a written copy of the seller's disclosure. C, deliver the property in substantially the same general condition as it was on the date of acceptance. Not, oh, we were under contract for 2 months and a lot of things happened to the property. No, you've got to give it in the same condition as it was at the time of acceptance. Ordinary wear and tear accepted, right? That doesn't mean you get to put big old stains in the middle of a carpet or anything like that. It's just so the buyer can't claim, well, you walked on the carpet for a month and I'm owed money for that, right? You understand the distinction? All right. And then when people leave the property, and we deal with this a lot, the seller is obligated to repair any seller or tenant moving related damage to the property. And oh, by the way, this is one of the times in the REPC it says this section shall survive closing. So just because you moved out of the house doesn't mean all bets are off. They can take this to court and say, there was $20,000 of damage done. Here's photos and evidence and blah, blah, blah. And they can't say, well, that went away when you signed that settlement. Nope. Here's the verbiage. It will survive closing. Okay. Final walkthrough and inspection. I only highlighted this because we've had some sellers who are like, I don't want them coming through the house. Well, you contractually agreed that they could up to 7 days prior to closing. It's a contractual term. And then changes during the transaction must be in writing, right? Well, sorry, this section actually is more about things you can't do. Sorry. You can't alter the property. You can't do a remodel. You can't take out a loan, a HELOC on the property once you're under contract. Again, short-term, long-term leases, property management agreements, you can't enter into new ones and further encumber the property. Authority of the signers, this is a reminder to both sides. If you're signing for an LLC or a trust, what must you do? Anybody, help me out.
Provide documentation that you are who you say you are. Some of that will include just providing the articles and incorporations.
Sure.
Which shows the principal, and then you can say, see, I'm a principal, and then you can sign.
So our fiduciary of reasonable care, Parker, I like that. You can go to the Department of Commerce and look up an LLC. You can't really do it with trusts because trusts are private documents. But if it's an LLC, you can see who the signers are. You pay $1, you get all the principal members. You know if somebody's signing is legitimate to sign, right? Because they're going to say it's the ABC Corporation, ABC, LLC, right? Well, who signs for that? if I'm one of the partners there, it's not adequate for me to sign as Matt Barton. Matt Barton is his own legal person. The way it should be signed, my office managers know I beat this horse to death. If you're signing, even though it says here, you still have an obligation to sign a certain way. And it would be Matt Barton, partner, or manager, or whatever my official designation is, ABC LLC. If it's a trust, Matt Barton, trustee for the Matt Barton Trust. It doesn't matter that it's my trust, because Matt Barton Physical isn't a separate legal entity than the trust. And so you must declare who's signing and what their authority is for the entity. It's exactly why title companies at settlement require people to sign that way as well, because if they don't have the right signature. Okay. Last thing, seller's default. Your sellers need to be aware, here are the consequences if you don't perform. Might I suggest this in closing? If you cover this well at the front end, when they're excited to sell their property, and you explain this to them, hey, listen, we're going to work hard. We're going to get you under contract. We're going to protect you all along the way. But if for some reason something changes in your life, something gets crazy, and you just decide arbitrarily to not sell, I need you to know what the consequences are. If the buyer put up $10,000 of earnest money, their first remedy, the easiest one, is to agree an equal amount from you, the seller, in liquidated damages. Or the buyer can maintain the earnest money in the trust account. That's a big one. Remember back our days with COVID when people would say non-refundable and released to the seller? That takes away one of your remedies, because the requirement was for the earnest money to stay in the trust account if you want to sue for performance. And then the third one is, go ahead, release the earnest money and then sue them for other remedies available at law. All right, guys, we are out of time. I know that was rapid pace. Next week, we will be covering the non-buyer, non-seller specific items and just some of the more general terms that have effect across the entire contract, not just specifically for the buyer or seller. Can I just ask a quick question? Is this helping you to be better agents and understand your contracts? I hope.
Yep.
I hope.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I hope you not only pride yourself on being more of a contract geek, but I hope you can really turn this as an advantage when you deal with your buyers or your sellers, right? And I'll just finish by suggesting this. If Dawn's my client, be like, Dawn, I don't know if this is important to you. I hope it is. I have invested a ton of time making sure that I know the contracts as much as I can. I attend twice a month calls where we go into great detail. Of course, you're always encouraged to have an attorney review it. But I just know from my 18, 20, 23 years in the business that a lot of agents don't put the time into this. And as a result, it creates unnecessary conflicts and problems along the way. I just want you to know that's not me. I'm here to work for you. I take pride in what I do. I invest a lot of time in knowing this, and I am here to answer any and all questions on these contracts, and I will always go through them at least at a 30,000 foot view so you know what the main components are. Fair enough?
Thanks, Matt.
I can tell you the vast majority of your competitors say nothing like that. They don't even address it. So start spinning it to your advantage. Okay? Everybody, have a great Monday. Have a great week, and we'll talk with you soon.
Hey, who's your NFL team?
Thanks,
Thanks,
Matt.
Well, it was the Bills up until last night.
That was so
Ah.
sad.
It was sad. Oh well.
Hey, I'll have to say that was an incredible game, though.
It was
Yeah,
an
I
amazing
mean,
game. It was so good.
Super exciting, but you know, I'm a big fan of the small market teams, and Josh Allen just seems like such a real dude. And I don't hate Kansas City. I think they're a great team, but I just wish they had got their opportunity to play for the championship next year.
Yeah. All
Okay,
right.
guys,
I
have a good one.
gotta know who to poke, once the college season's over.
My USC Trojans are coming strong next year. Watch out, baby. All right. See you guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep. Bye.